In this particular analysis, the countries with the lowest degree of income inequality are shown in dark blue, and the countries with the highest degree of income inequality are shown in the dark red. The gray represents countries for which there are no data available when this analysis was done. So here's the legend. Lowest income inequality, highest income inequality. North America, the United States has the worst income inequality. Canada is more equal income distribution. Most of Europe is in blue. Portugal has a worse income inequality in Western Europe. Notice there are a few countries in light blue here that have low degree of income inequality. Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world. South Korea. The point with Bangladesh having a lower degree of income inequality should be pretty telling. What we're saying here is that rich countries don't necessarily have lower degrees of income inequality than poorer countries. Here is Brazil, one of the countries historically that has had a very high degree of income inequality. It's interesting history to explain that. Bolivia. In South America, here you see a country with a lower degree of income inequality. It's been interesting analysis to figure out why this country has a lower degree of income inequality. There are a few in the Caribbean, but you get a snapshot of what's going on in the world. This chart is interesting, but it's not nearly as interesting as the one I'm going to go to next. And this is a graph of the Gini index for several countries around the world. We just calculated the Gini coefficient, and we said a higher degree of income inequality was represented by a higher Gini coefficient. So as you look at this particular line graph, you see Mexico in green, and Brazil looks like a purple. And for the data we have here, Brazil has the worst income distribution. Not the worst overall from the chart we just saw, but certainly among the countries listed here, Brazil has the highest degree of income inequality. And trending over the 50 or 60 years for the data, see Brazil has always had a high degree of income inequality. And Mexico as well, but Mexico's is trending downward, suggesting that things are becoming less unequal in Mexico. You might want to use the United States as a baseline, and you can actually try to calculate the number. It's just starting out around 37 or 38, just after World War II. And the most recent data show the US around 44 or so. So you would conclude that the income distribution in the United States has worsened over that 60-year period. You might want to go and identify a point such as this one right here, around late 60s, and ever since in that late 60s, that's 40 years or so, the income distribution has been worsening in the United States. Ever so slightly, but it's worsening. Even greater degree of worsening can be shown by the United Kingdom, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Not as bad as the US, and never has been, but you can see the trend. Worsening income distribution in the United Kingdom. I think this is India right here. So you see income at India. India is our standard numeraire country, the country used to start the discussion on income inequality and economic development, because India was the first country to become independent of its colonial master after World War II. So here is India around 1950. Again, less inequality than the United States, obviously a very poor country. Are things getting better in terms of the income inequality? But more recently, you'll notice that the income inequality is widening again in India. And based on the analysis you've done thus far, you would know that India has become increasingly more capitalistic since the 1980s, and look what is happening. Can you generalize and say that more capitalistic countries will have a higher degree of income inequality? I would say that that can be called a stylized fact, that once you allow the market forces to operate, the rich will find ways to get richer at the expense of the poor. It doesn't mean that everyone is not getting richer, it just means that the gap between the rich and the poor is widening. Here's France, and you see France is lowering the degree of income inequality over time. So one other table I want to show you, and effectively this would be the data that would go with the first chart you saw, but here are the actual numbers for select countries. These are alphabetically arranged, so we start with Argentina. I should tell you that the Gini coefficient here is being calculated by two agencies. The first here, United Nations, and the second source is the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, the CIA. Let's see if we can find a pattern. It looks as though the CIA's data are slightly lower. For Finland it's higher. For most countries it seems to be slightly lower. Sufficiently close that we can ignore the difference, but depending on the source you choose, and these might not all be for the same year, but we do have a year as a benchmark or indicator year for each country. So let's presume that the two agencies are calculating using slightly different data. Here's what we're seeing. We're seeing an index in the 40s, 46 for Argentina, or 51 by the UN's calculation. The first column for the United Nations takes the top 20% or the richest 20% and divides it by the income held by the poorest 20%. So this number here would be interpreted as saying that the richest 20% earn 18 times as much as the poorest 20% in Argentina. And that was for the year 2009. Let's go across the top row to Kenya, and the 8.2 would be interpreted as saying that the richest 20% in Kenya earn 8 times as much as the poorest 20%. So your conclusion would be that across these two countries, Argentina and Kenya, both developing countries, income inequality is worse in Argentina than in Kenya, even though Argentina would be a richer country than Kenya. Clearly you can see the index being lower in Kenya than in Argentina, and that should be expected. What is surprising to me is how high the index is, even though the gap is not nearly as wide in Kenya as in Argentina. If you want a rough and ready calculation of inequality, the first column here, the ratio of income to the richest 20% compared to the poorest 20%, this is a nice, quick calculation that everyone can do. And there are times that this is the number you'll want to go with. To get the Gini coefficient, you need to divide the population into 5 groups. So I would say that the source for these data would also tell you what the middle 3 groups of 20% earn, and then you do the long involved calculation to come up with the Gini coefficient. Again, area A, the area between the line of perfect income equality and the Lorenz curve, divided by that area I call 5,000, A plus B. I always tell my students when they have data in front of them to look for the highest and lowest numbers they can find and see if you can draw any conclusions, or what economists call stylized facts based on these findings. So if you want to just run your pen down the column here, 5 in Bangladesh. Remember we said Bangladesh had one of the lowest degrees of income inequality. Okay, so there's a 5. Here's Denmark. Here's Finland. France. So we see Finland having a much lower degree of income inequality, even than Bangladesh. and the index is below 30%, below 30 I should say, or 0.3. Denmark, similarly. Here's Norway, Luxembourg. So you see those countries that are very low, and you see the share of income going to the top 20% versus the bottom 20% here in Austria. Luxembourg, the data for the United Nations were not available, but we have the CIA's calculation 2005. Let's go down to the bottom of this table to make sure we see everything that's in the table. Again, we're looking for the lowest numbers we can find. Japan, and the highest numbers we can find here. Well, Guatemala, surely 20 times as much to the top 20% as to the bottom 20%. South Africa, 18. And I think that takes care of it. Oh yes, Paraguay, 26 times as much to the top 20% as the bottom 20%. Colombia, 25 times as much as well. So you get a sense as to the income distribution in various countries. Obviously, we are more concerned with poorer countries. And what I would say, we cannot conclude that poorer countries have worse income distributions. They have lower levels of income, but not necessarily worse income distributions.